is because it's still day. But since we met last week, of course, we had daylight savings time. So I think I'm going to come down to kind of a normal hue here as the sun begins to set. But this is sort of the best place for me to be able to present tonight. So I hope I'm not glaring at any of you, at least certainly not with my eyes. It is just a thrill to have all of us yet still together after this season of Lenten hues. I appreciate this, as my friend Steffi Owen has called it, this Lutheran happy hour that we have begun to establish here. That's been just a thrill for me to participate in creating some of these presentations. It is true that we have covered, like we've schlepped through a lot of thought. And so I thought that it might not be such a bad idea to do just kind of a quick cursory view, at least of all for those who might have not yet participated in the sessions leading up to this one. So I'm going to do a quick overview of how we got here. And then we'll get here and we'll move forward from that. So if you remember, we started by talking about resurrection, and that I suppose was a little bit of a strange way to begin a season on Lent, right? That's I think I called it bass backwards in one of our times together, because here it is Lent, and we're supposed to be, tradition tells us, diving into sort of the somber and the bleak, and then kind of working our way up to the momentum of resurrection. But I wanted to start with resurrection because I am very much of the mind that if we call ourselves Christians, then that name, which really, in point of fact, of course, is a faith declaration. It's a declaration to ourselves and to the world. That name Christians must mean something, right? It must be anchored in a specific kind of history, or at least a specific story, or a specific take on who we understand ourselves to be, our world to be, and not least of all, our God to be. So we talked about how we're called Christians because we believe that Jesus is the Christ. And we believe that Jesus is the Christ because we believe that Jesus is risen. Therefore, Jesus was called the Christ, right? Before that, he was Jesus. I think we talked a little bit about this before in that first session. Before the resurrection, he was Jesus, but it was really primarily after the resurrection in our sacred text that we begin to hear the designation of the term Christ for him. People began to pray in his name, heal in his name, and identify him as God. So the resurrection was that pivot point for people to understand Jesus not just as a good man, a faithful man, a martyr, but rather as indeed the Messiah. So we believe that Jesus is risen. And because we believe that Jesus is risen and therefore the Christ, we also believe, therefore, that life and not death has the last word. And because we believe that life rather than death has the last word, we cease, or at the very least, we're invited to cease allowing our fears, our tendencies towards self-preservation, our self-doubts, our trust more in our failures than in God's love to define us. We are instead defined by Easter's news rather than Good Friday's news. While, though that's true that Easter defines us, it is also true, of course, that Good Friday shapes us. And that brought us to our second session, which lingered in death. And in this particular gathering, we spoke about death and how when we think of it, we primarily call to mind this 6 foot under kind of death, right? The gathered around the grave sort of death. And anyone who has suffered the loss of a loved one's life knows that this is holy ground, standing on the dust of the earth beside the dust of their life, being nestled into it. Additionally, though, and I think all too often not recognized as it ought to be, we also suffer a variety of other kinds of deaths, like the death of hopes or the death of relationships, the death of a job, the death of a sense of self, the death of an addiction, of community, of mutual care and concern, of privilege. Not all death, by the way, is bad, but most death at the very least hurts. The death of the well-being of creation, and these days, the death of a way of life due to COVID, not to mention the actual death of over 500,000 people due to COVID. So we spent time in our second session to acknowledge those deaths and to recognize that death occurs outside of the normal and arguably socially acceptable moments of funerals and moments of Good Friday. But we don't really have a format for doing so. And that led us into our third session about lament. And we spoke about how the familiar and the beloved Lutheran green hymnal, the LBW, the Lutheran Book of Worship, contains no lament psalms. They were all excised by the editors, and it has no index headings whatsoever for hymns of lament, hymns of sorrow, or hymns of grief. A whole generation has had, therefore, no access whatsoever to vent their despair. So behind that, then, we discussed was the decent chance that Christians haven't been able or haven't been taught that lament is in point of fact holy. And perhaps conversely, that to acknowledge one's sorrow and even accompanying anger displays lack of faith and trust in God. But in point of fact, we talked about how lament, like anger, acknowledges disparity between what one knows is the case and what really, in point of fact, ought to be the case. This, not least of all, returned us then to our grounding in resurrection. We know that ultimately God's agenda for the world is that of life and not death. And were it to be the latter, Jesus would still be in that tomb of his. Moreover, we know that the one who was raised was hardly the ambassador of death, but rather the ambassador of life, healing, feeding, welcoming, forgiving, expressing righteous anger, teaching, enjoying really good food and really good wine, and offering hope. So where you see the opposite of that, personally, politically, or socially, namely where you see the creation of hurdles to healing, hurdles to feeding, hurdles to welcoming, where you see condemnation, acquiescence, and apathy in the face of evil, where you see a rejection of the fruits and the delights of creation and the cultivation of a culture of death, there you have reason to lament. Lament, that is in fact an act of trust in God over against what one experiences that isn't of God's way. And then last week, we fussed with the notion of the Holy Spirit as the trickster, and we depended on Lewis Hyde's book, Trickster Makes the World, in which he dives into the mythology of the trickster, the likes of the coyote, the fox, Loki, none of whom are inherently malevolent, but they are mischievous and they can cause pain. They enter into reality, says Hyde, especially stagnant reality, and then they begin their work. They pull up their sleeves and they begin to upheave it, right? To rearrange it, to create something new. And we looked at some of Hyde's interpretations and wondered whether or not the Holy Spirit, this expression of the Trinity with whom staid Christians aren't particularly sure, frankly, what to do with, might in fact be a classic, in fact, arguably even the classic trickster. Acts 2, which not least of all got the disciples called out as public drunkards, seems to lay some decent groundwork for the case. And so with that, now we're ready to look at process theology. That's what brought us to this moment. Process theology is a theological take that has, it's got some unwelcome reception in Lutheran circles. It's probably worth owning up to the fact that I've always found heretics to be interesting. And generally more interesting than the orthodox amongst us. This is one of the reasons, as an aside, I always prefer broken people to perfect people because they're just more interesting. But what I've often discovered is that those who are dismissed as heretics, those who have, say, claimed that, well, of course women should be preachers. Of course, theology should be established from the perspective of the poor. Have you not read Isaiah, Micah, Luke, including Mary's song? Of course, the gospel doesn't have any room for white supremacy, either of the arbiters of slavery, nor the insurrectionists of January 6th, nor the massacre of the Asians in Atlanta, nor within our voting systems. See, these are the so-called heretics, but they are actually the harbingers of fidelity to the gospel. And this, I believe, is the case of process theologians. So tonight, then, thanks to Buddhist thought and Jewish thought and St. Patrick, which I decided actually sounds like a bad joke, right? A Buddhist, a Jew, and St. Patrick went into a bar. But with these three folks and traditions at hand, we're going to wade into some process thought waters. But before I dive into the particulars of process theology, I want to lay out a couple of primary critiques against it, just so you can be kind of mindful of them as we progress tonight. First, process theology says that God does not know the future. And that, moreover, in fact, we co-create with God. This bugs some people. And second, process theology allows for some freedom for people to be able to make some choices. This bugs particularly some Lutheran people. But I stand before you, sit, I suppose, as the case is, before you tonight as a systematic theologian to say, A, there is absolutely no religious take that has it all sewn up. So humility, right? And B, so what if it does say that we co-create the future and that we might have some measure of latitude to make choices, right? And that's where we're going to have some fun, I think, tonight. So to laying it out. Ideally, as an aside, today will work best if you have either something to write with and on, or you can have some imagination to make sense out of the scribbles that I will draw for all to see. So if you don't have one or have one just kind of out of reach, go ahead and I'll cue up process thought a la St. Patrick's. I know I don't have any green. I have green socks. I'm not going to prove it to you, but I do have on green. Happy St. Patrick's Day to all of you as an aside. So St. Patrick is known for many things, not least of all for this particular prayer. Christ with me, Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ in me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me, Christ on my right, Christ on my left, Christ when I lie down, Christ when I sit down. It turns out that he wrote this prayer precisely when he had a bounty on his head. And those who were paid to have him squarely in view did at the particular moment that this prayer came to him. And so Patrick prayed these words, and legend has it that his hunters could only hear the sound of a deer passing rather than seeing Patrick pass by them instead. Now, a theologian, a guy by the name of Bruce Epperly, and this is the first link that's embedded in the chat. Bruce Epperly looks at Patrick's prayer and Celtic theology as a whole, and he says that some of the themes in both Patrick's prayer and in Celtic. Oh, I think we have a inadvertent shared screen. There we go. He says that if you look at Patrick's prayer and you look at Celtic theology, you've got some themes there that are related to process theology. That, for example, one, all things exist in the center of God's care. Two, God inspires all things from the inside as well as through relationships. Three, everything is cherished within God's circle of love. And fourth, God lovingly influences individuals and desires their well-being. God lovingly influences and desires also the well-being of all creation. Now, all of that is found directly on his page. So all things exist in the center of God's care. God inspires all things from the inside as well as through relationships. Everything is cherished within God's circle of love, and God lovingly influences individuals and desires their individual well-being, but also God lovingly influences and desires the well-being of all creation. In other words, it's about you, but it's not just about you. So none of this is foreign, and it's in fact deeply scriptural. So he points to several scriptural passages as cases in point. Psalm 139. Where can I go from your spirit? If I if I am brought to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. Namely, in the pit, you are there. Romans 8, Lutheran favorite here. Nothing, absolutely nothing in all of creation will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus. And then he also points to Acts 17. In God we live and move and have our very being. Now, some people, he points out, have called this sort of view of God panentheism. This is different from pantheism. Some of you might be more familiar with that term. Pantheism believes that God, theos, is everything, pan. So God is everything. So God is the tree I'm looking at, or God is the dresser, or God is me, that God is everything. But that's different than panentheism, which says that God is within everything, right? God is in all things. So pan, all, en, in, theos. So God is in all things and all things are within God. So that's panentheism, that God is in everything and everything is held by God. I am not yet detecting any heresy, right? This is all consistent with certainly with Lutheran theology, but this is where it starts to get interesting. Because process theology says that while God is indeed in all things, and all things are indeed in God, as Epperly says, God is also more than the world. And so process theology says that God provides possibilities for us. God provides options, invitations, or the word that is perhaps most often used in keeping with process theology. God lures us into the next moment. Process theologians say that every single moment matters. Because as insignificant as one might seem to be, so insignificant that we don't even notice it, a moment could indeed contain great significance. And so, Dad, I'm putting you on the spot here. If you can unmute, you and Mom met at Concordia College. Do you remember the moment when you saw Mom? There is no right answer, by the way. Do you remember the moment when you noticed Mom? Or where did you two meet?
In the cafeteria.
In the cafeteria. So they met in the cafeteria, and and you know, it's not a significant thing to be hungry, right? And so they met as they were both hungry in a place where people go to eat. So the moment was insignificant, and yet the moment had actually quite tremendous significance consequently. Like, thank you for noticing my mother. Right? Or
you're welcome.
But then also, you know, there are moments of tragedy and trauma. So most of you know about the accident that killed my late husband and gave Coral a TBI, a traumatic brain injury, when he was just 3. But that moment when that accident happened at a very insignificant location. We'd been at that corner countless times at that particular curve, and apparently all the witnesses said that my late husband looked to the right as he had Carl in his arms, looked to the left, looked to the right, and didn't look to the left again, which I think there would have been no reason why he should have. He'd done due diligence. There was a curve, unfortunately, and the car came around the curve and hit them as my late husband crossed the street. And so a moment that shouldn't, I mean, how many of us have crossed the street after looking 3 times, right? And lived to tell the story. And so the fact that he didn't look to the left was significant, but the fact that he didn't look to the left was also insignificant. And so moments of tremendous significance can be embedded, can be hidden in moments of insignificance. But there are other moments, right, that are obviously moments of significance. So when a child is born, something's happening and it carries tremendous significance. Or a decision to retire, that has tremendous significance. Or how many of us have ever listened to a piece of music or seen a piece of art that has radically changed how we feel in the moment, and maybe even transformed some possibilities for us in the future. So process theology invites us to be mindful of the moments, right? All of them, significant or insignificant, because process theology says God is active in every single one. So when process theology talks about moments, it's talking nanoseconds. There's no sliver of time small enough where God is not active in its midst. And here's a wonderful turn of phrase that process theology embraces. Every moment is redeemable, and every moment is redeemed. I love that. Process theology says every moment is redeemable, and every moment is redeemed. And still, I'm not hearing anything that makes my fidelity to God tremble, right? My little antenna isn't beginning to, heresy antenna isn't beginning to waver. And so if we then go forward with some confidence to tease this out more, if you have that piece of paper, grab it, and you're just gonna draw in the center of it an X. And so let's see if this is at all going to work. So here right there is an X in the center, and this X marks our present moment. This is the one we are all sharing via Zoom, right? Scattered all over. This X marks the spot of our particular present moment. Now, prior to this X, I want you to just draw, as many X's all over. It doesn't matter if they are in order or not. It doesn't matter. Just throw a bunch of X's there. And what you're doing is putting moments down that precede this particular moment. So these are all random moments that have preceded this particular moment. But what we begin to think about is that all of these particular moments that appear to be random weren't random insofar as they had significance to make us gather together here. So we already talked about how one of these moments is when my father noted my mother in the cafeteria at Concordia College, right? That's this moment. And had that moment not happened, we wouldn't be having this particular moment. I think we're having this particular moment also in part because I presented at a conference in Sanibel, Florida. I think, Pastor Ken, that's where we first met. Is that correct? Oh, I can't hear you. I'm sorry.
You came to the South Central Synod of Wisconsin.
That's it. Right. So you remember the moment, me not so much, but right. Okay. So we, but that moment, that conference, here's another moment, right? Right. And I just see, Steffi, you're right. Here's another moment that is sort of an extended moment, the pandemic. We wouldn't be here over Zoom if COVID had not happened. COVID, and this sort of jumps to a point later, out of bad moments eyes can be opened to new possibilities. And so I think as much as we might be all tired of Zooming, it has introduced us to the notion that, this can work, right? We can connect over space and time. But so these are some known moments. You folks are here because you must have seen something in a church newsletter or somehow or another gotten the word, and that moment brought you here. But you're also here because your parents met and your parents' parents met. But you're also here because perhaps your grandparents came over, and the only reason that they met was because one caught a ship and one missed a ship, right? And they landed together at the same time. Or you are here because somebody looked to the left instead of to the right, or you are here because of Neanderthals whom we'll never be able to trace, but somehow or another we're related to them, right? And so the point is that we have all of these moments that appear to be random, but in point of fact, we're all connected. What I won't have time to talk about is how there's just some wonderful conversation happening between process theologians and quantum physicists, because quantum physicists are saying the same thing, that we are all related in ways we can't ever understand, but that everything is connected. Some of you might be familiar with the butterfly of Brazil, that story, and how the butterfly's wings affected a long trajectory far, far away with world consequences. And that's quantum physics as well. So this notion that we're all interconnected it goes across disciplines, and I think even is again so very consistent with our notion of the communion of the saints and how we are all bound to earth and creation as well. We just haven't teased that out, I think, as intentionally as we could. So we'll never know, in point of fact, all of the moments that have flowed into this one. And we'll also never know all of the moments that are going to flow out of this particular moment. But just that very fact reveals to us that every moment is sacred. I'm led to recall my Old Testament professor, Dr. Lynn Nakamura, who pointed to the story of Moses in the burning bush and how God told Moses to take off his shoes because he was standing on holy ground, right? And she said, that's to say that all ground is holy. Even the dust from which springs an ordinary bush, and even an ordinary bush can be the location of a revelation from God. No ground is holier than another. No moment is holier than another, because all ground, all moments are contained in God, and God is present in all ground and all moments. Now, here's where, again, another step where it might get a little bit tricky. Process theology says that while we can never know all of the moments that have direct bearing on this moment, in fact, strictly speaking, process theology says that all moments preceding this one did have bearing on this particular moment. Process theology says that the more that we know about the past, the more that we know about the present. And therefore, the more that we can be discerning about what future moments can and are called to be. So one way of thinking about this is about the value of therapy. Because if you avail yourself to therapy, it's a way of accessing the past to learn more about who are you now. Every aha moment, so that explains it, right? Every aha moment is a moment of the past that's just that much more revealed. And it also invites a present moment to be just that much more enlightened. But another way, I think, of thinking about the value of considering the past is to ponder the present rise, or perhaps better understood, the present unveiling of white supremacy, the momentum behind the Black Lives Matter movement, the rejoicing of a Native woman as the Secretary of the Interior, the hypocrisy of keeping people out of the borders who are coming into the US, not least of all, precisely because of the result of the way in which US policies have created this very flood of refugees. unless you see we pay attention to the way in which history has come to be, we can neither see nor appreciate the cries for justice and the cries of rejoicing when justice is, albeit uncomfortably for some, come. So process theology says that the past matters, and it behooves us to know it as well as we can. And process theology says that God does know it. And moreover, process theology says that God knows all that is happening right now, in this very moment, and not just in our shared moment, but in all moments everywhere now. But what God does not know, says process theology, couple of weeks ago, the notion that God has a plan that's carried out is absolutely anathema to process thought and to much of Jewish thought. And I believe it should be anathema in most of Christian thought too. If God has an immutable plan, if God does know the future, as we have said, then we have neither agency nor investment in any moment, in no past moment, in no present moment, and in no future moment either. Que sera, sera. As I've often said, though, we become nothing more than actors on a stage being played like puppets. We have no ability to shift where we are on the stage, to riff our lines, or even to change how we say them. It's all planned out. And what happens is we become no longer humans, but we become automatons. And moreover, to say that God has a plan that is inevitably carried out condones tremendous violence and trauma. I mentioned the Jewish thinker in one of our earlier sessions who said post-Shoah, post-Holocaust, that whatever you say about God has to be said in Auschwitz. And if you can't say what you want to say about God in that place, a place where assuredly sandals should be taken off, should be removed, then, says the thinker, shut up that clearly. Just know it unequivocally, stop talking. But you see, to circle back to the resurrection, if we are Christians, if we are Christians, we believe that Jesus is risen from the dead. Jesus was the one not who caused death of any sort, but who instead redeemed it. And so given those two examples alone, although more could be said, the whole plan notion, I am over it. But what I am not over theologically, and what process theology espouses, is that God may not have a vision, does not have a vision, but that God does not have a plan, but that God does have a vision, that God does have an agenda. So process theology rejects the notion of God having a plan, but espouses that God does have a vision, an agenda for the future. God knows what God wants the future to be. And God does on the basis of knowing the past, knowing the present, and God's inherent, fundamental, constitutional bent toward redemption over judgment, hope over despair, delight over pain, and life over death. So given that, says process theology, God is busy pitching out these lures, like a fishing lure, right? Ways of catching our attention to pull us into the future that God intends and for which God hopes. It's super key to note that there need not just be one right lure. God does see complexity and nuance and subtlety and shades. And so God is pitching out a lure or several lures to pull us into the next moment. But, says process theology, it turns out that God isn't the only one doing this. You don't even have to think about it in terms of some nebulous anti-God. There are simply a number of choices available to us, and some are more winners than others. There are simply some bad choices that we can make. No one here, I'm sure, present company excluded, but I hope you can nonetheless see my point. So process theology then invites us to think about how it is that we make our decisions. On what basis are we determining that something is the right move to make or not? Who, in point of fact, the basic question is, or what is our God? It's basic first commandment stuff, right? How we understand God shapes how we live our lives. And if you recall in our first session together, Luther said that our God is that in which or in whom we place our ultimate trust. The thing we trust most is our God, and we bend our lives around our God. And so our God can be the God who brings life out of death, who delights in creation and good food and everyone being fed, or God can be a God of fear and threat. Or God can be a human and a transient ruler, or God can be fear of change, or God can be an addiction, or God can be self-doubt, or God can be even blessings like children and spouses whom we love, but who move away or who die. The question is whether the thing which we trust as God can bear the weight of our trust. So some of you might recall the books you might have read as a child. They were typically very thick and small, and maybe I mentioned them earlier because I loved these books as a kid. Steffi, I don't know if you remember these, but you would read them and you'd get to the end of a page, and then you'd have a choice. Do you want to go down the hall, or do you want to enter into the closet, right? And so the whole book was thick because it was simply a compilation of choices. And so you'd get to the page, you'd decide which one you'd want, and you'd flip to that page. But I am not ashamed to say, if I didn't like the choice, I'd go back. But life isn't like that, right? You can't go back and say, oops, never mind. I choose, option Z, instead. And so we're given an opportunity, sort of like these books, right? An opportunity to be mindful and to consider our past, to consider how we got here, and also to consider not just how this present moment affects us or will affect us, but how this present moment will affect countless other people, a very few of whom we might even know. And also then, therefore, whether our choice reflects God's agenda of bringing salvation, which we talked about earlier, means in the Greek, health, healing, and wholeness into the world. Sometimes we're going to get it right. Sometimes we're going to hearken to the lure and we're going to be pulled toward God's agenda, and God sings hallelujah and moves on to the next moment. But sometimes we mess up. Sometimes we opt for the wrong lure, in which case God swears, God weeps, and then God also moves on to the next moment. Why? Because process theology says that every moment is redeemable and every moment is redeemed. A rabbi by the name of Bradley Artson does brilliant work on process theology. That's another link that was sent to you earlier. I'm afraid that it might be a podcast only available to those of you who have access to Apple Podcasts. If so, I apologize, but I sent it forward just in case. You can certainly find him online. I think I also sent a link to the Wikipedia entry about him. Excuse me. He says that in the Jewish prayer book to which he regularly turns, there's a marvelous description of God, which says, God, you are the one who renews the work of creation every single day. I love that. God, you are the one who renews single moment is the moment of new creation. The world has never existed the way it exists now, or now, or now. Each moment is brand new. This is basic Genesis stuff, right? Basic Pauline stuff. It's basic theology of the cross stuff right there. God is a creator God, bringing something new out of every single moment. God is not a destroyer God, but a bringer of life God. Everything changes, as we spoke about in last week's Trickster session. You get in trouble when things don't. Nothing is ever the same. And if you can't acknowledge it, you run the risk of death. In fact, the name of the podcast to which I am referring here of Art Sins is You Can't Step in the Same River Twice. And you think about it, and like we have a river right up the way called Baptism River, which is perfect for like that preaches. But you can't step in that twice. I can step in it and I can go grab a cookie on the shore, and then I can look for an agate and I can go back. I can step in the same baptism river, except it's not. And you aren't the same person now that you were 10 years ago. And frankly, you aren't even the same person now that you were 10 minutes ago, because in the intervening time, life happened and death happened. The temptation, I think, is to cling to the familiar, to the known. And this knack isn't lost on Rabbi Artson. And he addresses it by quoting Rabbi Harold Kushner. I think many of us have heard of him and his work with death. His son died as a teenager from a rare disease, and he had to face this notion of where is God in the midst of suffering. And so there's a book, Conquering Fear, Living Boldly in an Uncertain World. Artson makes reference to this, and I hope I sent that link with the rest of them. And in it, Kushner says, I may be nostalgic for the world I grew up in, Brooklyn in the 1940s, a world of stable neighborhoods, stable jobs, stable marriages, until I remember that the superficial stability rested on the assumption that Blacks, Jews, and women would know their place and not aspire to too much, that people born gay would live a life of pretense and denial, and that people trapped in abusive or unsatisfying marriages would endure them rather than face social disapproval. There's a lot about that world that I miss, but there is much about the things that have changed since then that I welcome and even celebrate. So to that, Rabbi Artson adds, we're always created new. At each moment new, the world is fresh and glistening and full of potential. It's new. And so there is no repetition of yesterday. That's a toxic fantasy designed by people who wish to trap us in fear. That means that we cannot make America great again, but we can make America great. That means that we don't pray to return to the old days. They weren't so good and they are gone anyway. That means that we ask God to renew our days so that they are new, just as God did in the past. I think it seems like process theology contains, you see, rich Lenten blessings. We mess up horribly, and humanity and creation weeps when we do. And so does God. And as we spoke about in our sessions on lament and death, these are real, and to look at them and to look away from them causes more pain and arguably is evidence of even more evil, because evil thrives when it is ignored or when it is tolerated. But God's commitment is renewal. This is God's basic bent. Think, you have heard it said, but now I say unto you, today salvation, health, healing, and wholeness has come to you. We're defined not by our mistakes, but by God's loving us into something more than them. We are defined not by the threat of life, but by the promise of life. And we matter. Our actions, our participation, our investment in the reign of God have consequences. Mindfulness of this fact isn't about works, as some Lutherans have accused process theology, but rather it's about freedom, about responsibility, and about living in the communion of the saints rather than in the unity of me. there's a Buddhist story. I was looking for the book around and I couldn't find it, but you can just type this, just type farmer and maybe and Buddhist, and you'll find it online. But it's short and it goes like this. An old farmer worked on his crops for many years, and one day his horse ran away. And upon hearing the news, his neighbors came to visit. Such bad luck, they said sympathetically. Maybe, the farmer replied. And the next morning, the horse returned, bringing with it 3 other wild horses. How wonderful, the neighbors exclaimed. Maybe, replied the old man. The following day, his son tried to ride. One of the untamed horses was thrown and broke his leg, and the neighbors came again to offer their sympathy on his misfortune. Maybe, answered the farmer. And the day after, military officials came to the village to draft young men into the army, and seeing that the son's leg was broken, they passed him by. The neighbors congratulated the farmer on how well things had turned out. Maybe, said the farmer. And with that, of course, the story ends. Now, the Christian in me is not content with the maybe, because some things are worthy of denouncing, right? And some things are worthy of rejoicing. But the tale does invite us to see that the potential of every moment is always a mystery to us, and arguably even to God. But there are clues of God, and within each moment to behold, clues which can lead us further down the path of God's vision for us and for the world. That's all I have for tonight. I'm eager to see and hear what you folks have for me. What you got?
It does make sense. I was a little lost last week, but when you started and re-explained, oh, okay, I got it. I don't know, my head was somewhere else. Now it does make sense.
No, I actually have a mind kind of like that. I had to take, well, I didn't have to. I don't know why I did it. I took Greek at college, and I was horrible at it. Absolutely tanked it. And it was almost reason for me to not go to seminary, because I knew I had to pass Greek in order to go on. But when I went back to it, crash coursing right before seminary, I kind of figured out where we were going, like what the point was. And then it made sense. Like, oh, that's why the accent on that word matters, right? And so that's why I wanted to do the review, because independently it was a lot, but I think there really is a connection from one theme to the next. So I'm glad. Don't feel badly that you didn't get it. I've read the Trickster book, I'm sure 3 or 4 times, and I'm still gleaning new things from it. So don't feel badly at all, but I am glad that the review made some sense. What else?
So I might have missed it, but at the beginning you were going through and you were saying, well, my heresy detector is not going off yet. And so is there any point where your heresy detector is going off?
So 2 things. The short answer is no, which, makes me wonder, what am I missing? The other, but I think that's almost true. The other piece is that the woman who has taught me the most about process theology is a woman named Kirsten Mayboost. And she's a professor, an adjunct professor at Augsburg College, and is seriously the wisest woman I know. For those of you who are familiar with The Wrinkle in Time, there was kind of one of the meta women. There was Mrs. Who, Mrs. Which, and Mrs. what's it, I think. And I think it was Mrs. who is kind of the meta one. That's Kirsten Mayboost. And Kirsten Mayboost is a process theologian who is just, again, quiet and wise and thoughtful. And I trust her implicitly on all things right and good. And if she's okay with process theology, then I'm okay with process theology. We do have a strong Lutheran tradition increasingly related to process theology. Paul Sponheim is a professor, retired professor, dead. I think you and he are or have been colleagues together. You're sort of the same vintage, if I recall. Is that correct?
That's correct. And he's brilliant.
Yep.
Trickster
Yeah.
Guardian.
Yeah, and he is brilliant. I think that some of his works have been hard for some people to access, and so Kirsten Mayboost is the Paul Sponheim whisperer, and so I appreciate that an awful lot. One of the questions that that I have yet to uncover. And I am enthralled by it, but still kind of a newbie at understanding it as well as I wish I were to. So one of my questions remains, is there anything consistent with the Christian expectation of a second coming? And that answer is outstanding for me. That is to say, I haven't grasped the response. Some might say that resurrection happens again in every single moment, which I could sort of think about. For example, had the accident not happened, my family, including Dad, wouldn't be up here on the North Shore where we have better care for Carl. We have this beautiful spot. We have a lake, et cetera, and all of that is true. What is also true is that Carl isn't completely healed, and moreover, we're still embedded in systemic lots of evil, injustice, and so forth. Like that hasn't ever changed. I think it's also worthy of note that the second coming, this notion, this hope that we have of a second coming, is a major criticism of Christianity in general. Like, why did Jesus not just sort of call it a wrap when he had the chance? Like in between the ascension and now, tremendous suffering and pain has occurred. And so what are we waiting for? Is God busy? Is like what? And so these are substantive questions. And it's also worth noting that this is one of the reasons why Jews do not believe that Jesus was the Messiah, because there is still suffering. And so when the Messiah comes, all shall be redeemed. There's this powerful story. I meant to call attention to it last week. I don't recall if I did or not. Elie Wiesel died within the last 10 years, I think, and he was a Holocaust survivor and an incredible author, Nobel winner. He wrote a Night, most famously, I think, but he also told the tale of how when he was suffering in the camps in Auschwitz, I believe it was, he was among several rabbis who put God on trial. They actually held a trial, and in fact, he made a play out of this incident. And I think it's called The Trial of God, or maybe just The Trial. But they actually put God on trial, holding God accountable to God's promises, holding God accountable to God's revelations in Scripture, and in their prison camp, they found God guilty. that God was guilty for the suffering of the Jewish people. And then the tale ends, they went and praised God. Right. I mean, there's this paradox. And really, I think one of the distinctions between Jews and Christians, and we have so much to learn from the Jews in this regard, is that they at least acknowledge that there is disparity between what we expect of God and what is. And we're uncomfortable with that. We don't have a ready framework for beginning to hold conversations or have maybe not answers, but at least responses about why is there so much suffering. One of my mentors in this regard, a Jewish rabbi, said to me, we had numbers of conversations about this, and he said to me, if Jesus is the Redeemer, where is the redemption? And it's a question. Without, I think, a decent answer, although there are responses. And one of the responses is that so much suffering has happened in large part because the church has not embodied the reign of God. A perfect illustration of this has to do with the white gentleman person who murdered these Asian people yesterday in Atlanta, and he's a son of a pastor in a Baptist congregation that taught white supremacy, and in the name of God. And you don't even have to actively teach it. To not teach about it also empowers evil, right? To not preach against injustice also enables evil. And so when the question is posed, if Jesus is the Redeemer, where's the redemption? I think it indicts less Jesus and more the people who align themselves purportedly with Jesus. Where are we? How are we serving? Are we serving as ambassadors of the reign of God? And so process theology would, I think, encourage us to be more alert to to the lure of God, to be engaged in the reign of God. And I think we have, in our Lutheran tradition specifically, been far too quietistic and pietistic, and consequently caused harm. So I think one of my questions, my outstanding questions for process theology is, what do you make of the second coming? You know, where is there a time when there ever will be complete healing? But that same question I pose to standard garden variety Christian theology. Soon and very soon, according, like, what's the metric? How long? What does soon mean? And I think that's a valid question, that it doesn't just put the spotlight on process theology, but puts the spotlight on Christian theology.
Thank you.
There's a question here. If we are to learn from the past to move forward in the now and future, how does this impact things happening today?
Yeah, well, I think I really appreciate the Buddhist emphasis on mindfulness, of being alert and aware of what is going on in the moment. Excuse me. I think Christian theology can augment that mindfulness by knowing that the mindfulness doesn't happen in a vacuum, but is embedded in a history. And so if we know something of our history, we can be all the more alert to where the lure of God was missed in the past, and yet very actively present in the moment, in the present moment. And so to know something about the past reminds us, I think, of its bearing on the future, which is our present, right? So to know something of the past gives us an awareness and alertness to how the past affects the present, and that present is, or affects the future, and that present happens to be the future happens to be our present right now. So I think, how does it shape our present and how does it shape our future? If we recognize that one day, this X will be somebody else's present moment and will be one of these random X's, but still have impact. Like our attentiveness to God's lures here has import for here. And so I think, among other things, it provides us this interesting mix of both a sense of humility, like to recognize I matter. How, like, that's revolutionary. I matter in ways I can't even fathom. I matter. So there's a humility, but there's also this empowerment. I matter. Like, what I do has effect. And so bring it on, right? And so there's a capacity for us to grasp the moment that I think is something that Lutherans have been uncomfortable with doing because it sounds too much like works. But I think what process theology does is empower us to say what you do matters, whether what you do or don't do matters. So do something.
So here's maybe an example. Anna,
Yeah,
the
good.
reason you don't remember meeting me at the South Central Synod of Wisconsin presentation is because I didn't meet you. I was
Oh, that makes me feel
introduced to
better.
your work. Do you know what I mean? I was introduced to your work. I'm the kind of Lutheran that would sit in the back row, and I was intrigued by what you had to say and kind of the innovative ways that you were thinking about theology. And so then I was on my way somewhere else where I was going to be able to cross paths with you. So I made an appointment and we met at your home because
Yeah.
So
Well, were you not in Sanibel?
I was not in Sanibel.
I wonder who that moment was.
I don't know. But it's because you made an impression on something you had to say. I followed up with that and made a different moment out of that, and more moments have come of that.
And here we are.
And so process theology, when you talk about it, it's not new because Paul Sponheim was a professor when I was in seminary.
Yeah.
He was at Luther Seminary. So were a lot of other wonderful, wonderful professors at the time. And what you say is it wasn't easy to discern what you could tell he was brilliant. I couldn't always access his brilliance. So it's an interesting kind of thing, but this isn't like just made up recently. This is something that's been developed in the thought, and I always measure things against really theology of the cross, some of the Lutheran theology. And I, like Anna, have not found many ways that this can't be true or this doesn't make sense. And so I keep looking into that too. And what it does for me is it drives me deeper into trying to understand what faith is about and how I live and move in the world. It's just an interesting way of thinking fresh things about what sometimes seems so dreary. I was just teaching the Lord's Prayer, and I was reading something about Martin Luther, and the language is so old in what he talks about in one of the segments of the Lord's Prayer. And I'm thinking, this does not connect with where we are right now. But that doesn't mean it's not true. It's just not accessible in this format. So it's just kind of interesting how these things roll out.
Yeah, absolutely. I so appreciate I appreciate that illustration. I also appreciate you saying you haven't found anything that seems to be. I think the biggest Lutheran critique is that there is this notion of co-creating, because there's an audacity that seems to be latent in it, and also a sense of works, that we have the capacity to be able to engage God, and I think that's what causes a number of Lutherans anxiety. But I think that is missing what process theology is, I think, trying to say. And moreover, it isn't acknowledging that that the converse is that everything is, in a sense, preordained, and that the consequences of saying we don't have to do anything means passivity, not least of all in a way that allows evil to go forward. And so I know it was a real issue within the seminary at Luther, and I don't know that it's ever quite been resolved. But I'm intrigued that Paul Sponheim was able to stand his ground and maintain at least of all probably his position there.
That takes me to the body of Christ, where we're called actually to be really in partnership with each other in being the church in the world. So it's intriguing. It's all intriguing to me. And thank you all for joining us for another segment of this. Next week, we're talking about Holy Saturday. And Holy Saturday is the day that we often don't do much at all in Holy Week. Some people have services on Saturday night that lead into an Easter, it's called an Easter Vigil. We don't practice that at Peace, but this Holy Saturday between Good Friday and Easter is just a fascinating thing to consider as well. So please join us for that as we go along. Some people have already asked where they can find the recording of this so they can listen again. If you go onto our website at Explore Peace, www.explorepeace.org, excuse me, and you go under news and events, there's a section on Lent, and it talks about this. You just click on that, and you'll see the list of all the weeks of this and their topics. And you just click on that, and you can go right into the YouTube video that will take you through this again.
I know that there were one or two questions that were posed to me individually, which I'm afraid I can't see easily. Would you mind throwing my email address in the link so people can send either them to me? It's anna@omgcenter.com, or obviously feel free to send them to your pastoral staff. I think I caught one briefly, which had to do with the question of why is it that we miss God's lure? I think that's a substantially great question. And so if I got it, you're welcome to send me an email, but you don't need to. I think regardless, even if that weren't your question, we'll address that one next week in one way or another. And I think it has some bearing upon the question of Holy Saturday too.
Wonderful.
Thank you all.
I think heads are full and nourished, and we have a lot to ponder and think about. So go in peace, serve the Lord.
Thank you, Anna.
Thanks be to God.
Thanks,
Peace.
Anna.
Bye-bye.